Nolan Wells' bombshell report tonight. Does it reveal new witnesses? And because of the new timeline report, is there a timeline shift in what happened the afternoon and evening? Nolan Wells seemingly disappears. His body found washed up at Horn Island. Good evening. I'm Nancy Grace. This is Crime Stories. I want to thank you for being with us. In that autopsy.
Now I really want to see the other autopsy to see, is there trauma to the body? Is there something that happened?
I couldn't believe it. I could not believe it.
I have no doubt that what we're listening to and what she did is credible.
Only has a timeline been analyzed by the Cajun Navy, the U.S. Cajun Navy, based on all sorts of statistical data. New photos are emerging. Take a look at this photo before we... Cajun Navy, look at this. Check out what you're seeing. Look at all the boats surrounding where Nolan was. Leave up the photo out to Caitlin Becker, senior national correspondent, New York Post, star of New York Postcast, their new podcast. Caitlin, what are we seeing?
Well, what we're seeing here comes from this new report from the United Cajun Navy, and you're seeing several boats strung together. This is one of the first images that we've seen of this certain configuration of boats there. They're all identified, one of which was the boat that Nolan came out there on. There's several others kind of anchored with it and tied up, which begs the question of where was Nolan when this photo was taken, because it's unclear if he's actually in it, what time was. So what you're seeing here is, as you said, a potential pool of witnesses.
Hey, Caitlin, look at this. There's boat number 1. There's boat X. There's boat number 2. There's boat number 3. And there's a boat from which the photo is taken. Now, look in the water. There much has been made. Nolan Wells was drinking. Okay, well, apparently everybody was. They all have containers, open containers in the water. Okay, as far as I know, that's not a felony. Boat number 1, full of people. Boat X, full of people. Boat number 2, full of people. Boat number 3, full of people. People on the boat from which the photo was taken. Some of these boats tied together. You know what that means in my world, Caitlin Becker, joining us in the New York Post? Let me see. That means witnesses. See, when I look at that, I see witnesses. Other people say, hey, there's people having a good time. I see witnesses. Do you see all those people?
And a lot of them.
Who were they? Have they been spoken to? Have they been polygraphed? What can they tell me?
That is the question, right? We don't know from an investigative standpoint who has been told law enforcement hasn't been.
Witnesses. Do you see all those people?
And a lot of them.
Who were they? Have they been spoken to? Have they been polygraphed? What can they tell me?
That is the question, right? We don't know from an investigative standpoint who has been spoken to, exactly who is in this photo, and what they have or haven't told law enforcement, because there hasn't been really any transparency there. But from what our reporting has showed, there have been dozens of people who have spoken to law enforcement as witnesses. But Nancy, we don't know if it's any of these people that you're seeing in this little cove area right here. And the timing, I think, is really important, because these images are taken right around, I think the timeline's about 3:30-ish, 4:30-ish, when the boat that Nolan came out there on leaves and starts taking on water. That's one of the pegs for the timeline. When these photos were actually taken, that is a peg for a timeline. But what we don't know is where Nolan is. There he is. You can see that image right there. But we don't know is where Nolan was when that first image that we saw with all of those boats kind of tied together, when that was taken.
You are seeing a photo obtained by our friends at the United.
The 4th of July is supposed to be a celebration. Fireworks, laughter, the kind of heat that makes the water feel like mercy. Along the Mississippi Gulf Coast, one of the most beloved ways to mark that holiday is to load up a boat, head out to Horn Island, and spend the day anchored in the shallows, with friends, music, and the kind of freedom that only comes when you're miles from shore and everything ordinary feels far away. That is exactly what Nolan Wells did on July 4th. He climbed aboard a boat called the Triton with a small group of friends and they made the trip out to Horn Island, a remote, uninhabited barrier island accessible only by water, sitting off the coast of Ocean Springs, Mississippi. The island had no facilities, no roads, no permanent structures. Just sand, trees, water, and on that particular day, an enormous gathering of holiday revelers spread across dozens of boats anchored side by side in the Gulf. Nolan Wells was young, slim, sociable, the kind of person who could move through a crowd and strike up a conversation with a stranger without a second thought. By every account from those who knew him, he was full of life. His best friend, Warren Hudson, would later speak about him publicly, describing someone whose personality filled whatever space he walked into. But somewhere between the afternoon heat of July 4th and the quiet that followed, Nolan Wells vanished. Not in the way people vanish in movies, dramatically, with a scream or a splash loud enough for someone to turn around. He vanished quietly, in the middle of a crowd, surrounded by boats, surrounded by people, and no one, at least no one who has come forward with a clear account, says they saw exactly what happened. His body was later found washed up on Horn Island, and that is where the questions begin. If you want to follow this case as new information continues to emerge, you are in the right place. Subscribe to Unrivaled True Crime and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Every week, we go deeper into the cases that deserve more than a headline. Now let's get into what the evidence actually shows. The physical geography of Horn Island matters enormously to understanding this case. The island has what investigators and search teams have described as a very aggressive underwater slope. That means a person can be standing in water that reaches their waist, take 3 or 4 steps forward, and suddenly find themselves in water that is well over their head. The transition happens fast. For someone who has been in the water for hours, who may have consumed alcohol, and who is socializing in a crowd where no single person is watching any other single person, that kind of geography is genuinely dangerous. What makes this detail more alarming is what the United Cajun Navy, a volunteer water rescue and disaster response organization that became deeply involved in the search for Nolan Wells, observed in photographs submitted to them by the public. Multiple images taken at Horn Island on July 4th showed groups of people standing in water that reached their armpits. Some photos appeared to show individuals, particularly those of shorter stature, in water that came close to their necks. These were not people swimming. These were people standing in place, socializing, holding drinks, in water that, depending on a single misstep, could have carried them beyond the point where their feet could touch the ground. The United Cajun Navy published a formal timeline report compiled from photos, videos, and social media posts submitted by members of the public who were present at Horn Island that day, or who had received materials from people who were. Vice President Brian Trasher, who has been a central figure in the organization's involvement in this case, was careful to describe the document as a timeline, not an investigative report. He emphasized that the organization is not a law enforcement body, and that the report was intended to compile publicly available information into a digestible format that might be helpful to investigators and to the public trying to understand what happened. That timeline report is the most comprehensive publicly available account of the events of July 4th on Horn Island, and what it reveals raises serious questions. Nolan arrived at Horn Island on the Triton with a small group of 3 or 4 people. But the Triton was not the only vessel carrying members of Nolan's broader social circle that day. There were reportedly 3 to 4 boats total, each carrying friends or acquaintances, spread across the water near Horn Island. This is important because it fundamentally changes the picture of who was responsible for making sure Nolan got home safely. The popular assumption, repeated in early public discussions of the case, was that Nolan's friends on the Triton were the ones who left him behind. But Warren Hudson, described as Nolan's closest friend, did not travel to Horn Island on the Triton. He arrived on a separate boat. That detail, which was largely lost in the early wave of public discourse, changes the structure of accountability significantly. If Nolan was part of a larger group spread across multiple boats, then the question of which boat he was supposed to return on is not as simple as it first appeared. Dave Mack, an investigative reporter covering the case, raised this question directly. Was Nolan ever planning to return on the Triton? The friends on the Triton have stated that Nolan came out with them and they expected him to return with them. But if that was never the original plan, if Nolan had intended all along to return on a different vessel, then the entire framing of the departure becomes more complicated. That question has not been definitively answered. What is documented is this. At some point in the afternoon, Nolan began speaking with a young woman who has been identified in public reporting only as Katie. The circumstances of how they met and the length of their conversation have been described differently by different people. The friends on the Triton have described Katie as someone none of them knew, a stranger that Nolan had just met on the island that day. They have been quoted describing her in vague terms as simply, "that girl," or "some girl," suggesting she was entirely unknown to them. That account, however, does not hold up against what emerged later. It became apparent that at least one member of Nolan's friend group had been communicating with Katie by text. The name Katie was known. The person was not a stranger to everyone in the group, even if some members genuinely had not met her before. When this discrepancy became public, it prompted significant scrutiny. Why would anyone in the group claim total ignorance of someone they were actively texting? That inconsistency has never been fully explained. Katie's sister addressed the situation publicly in a post that was obtained and reported on by multiple outlets covering the case. According to that account, Katie spoke with Nolan briefly. During that conversation, she said she could hear his friends calling him back to the boat, urging him to get on. Katie assumed from the context of what she heard and observed that Nolan was returning to his friends and would be boarding the Triton. She herself left Horn Island on a separate boat, not the Triton, and assumed that Nolan had departed safely with his group. The friends on the Triton offer a different version. According to their account, they pleaded with Nolan to board the vessel before they departed. They say he declined, telling them he wanted to stay and continue speaking with Katie. They left without him. Both of these accounts cannot be fully accurate at the same time. Either Katie's recollection is mistaken or the friend's version is incomplete. Or something else happened in the gap between those two accounts, something that no one has yet fully explained on the record. What is confirmed is that when the Triton left Horn Island, Nolan Wells was not on it. And his phone was. That fact deserves to stand alone for a moment. Nolan Wells was left on a remote, uninhabited island with no roads, no facilities, accessible only by boat, with no phone. No way to call for help, no way to reach anyone, no way to let the people who cared about him know where he was or whether he needed assistance. Whether the phone was forgotten or left intentionally, the result was the same. Nolan was effectively cut off. The Triton itself encountered problems shortly after leaving Horn Island. The vessel began taking on water. A distress or tow call was made, reportedly to Sea Tow or Coast Guard, at some point between 3 p.m. and 4:30 p.m. The exact recorded time of that call exists in official archives. A man named Bart Edmondson, described as a neighbor acting out of simple goodwill, ended up towing the Triton after the professional tow was reportedly canceled. Reports indicate that Nolan's grandfather made the call to cancel the professional service after a private arrangement had been made. Bart Edmondson did nothing more than help a boat in distress. He has nonetheless faced public scrutiny and pressure since the case gained national attention, an example of how quickly unverified suspicion can attach itself to people who had no wrongful involvement in anything. GPS data from the Triton reportedly shows the boat's departure from Horn Island at approximately 4:31 p.m. That time has been cited as one of the anchor points, one of the clearest timestamps, in the publicly available timeline. The United Cajun Navy's report also references a photograph taken at approximately 4:50 p.m. after the Triton's recorded departure, which shows a figure on the beach matching Nolan's general description, a slender African-American male wearing blue swim trunks. The organization was explicit in stating they could not verify whether the individual in the photograph was Nolan. The image was partially obscured, the figure was not clearly visible, and it was unknown whether the photo had been digitally altered or filtered. It was included in the report as a possibility, something to investigate, not something to assert. If it were Nolan, it would place him alive on Horn Island after the Triton had already left. That would be significant. But verification is exactly what that photo still lacks. The United Cajun Navy also noted a limitation that applied to many of the images they received. Timestamps on photographs may reflect when the image was screenshotted and saved, rather than when the original photo was taken. This is a technical reality of how images circulate on social media, and the organization was transparent about it. It means that while the photos are useful as context, their exact timestamps cannot be treated as definitive evidence of what happened at any specific moment. The Timeline report's most striking photograph is the one showing multiple boats anchored or tied together near Horn Island. In that single image, you can see Boat 1, Boat 2, Boat 3, Boat X, as labeled in the report, along with the vessel from which the photo itself was taken. These boats carried significant numbers of people in and around the water, holding drinks, socializing. The water level visible in the image is consistent with the armpit depth descriptions noted elsewhere in the report. Every person on those boats is, in the most direct sense, a potential witness. They were present at the location where Nolan Wells was last seen. They may have photographs, they may have video, they may have memories of something that at the time seemed unremarkable but, in context, could be critical. Boats in the United States are required to be registered. Registration records include identifying information about the vessel's owner. Vessel names, like Triton or Mac Daddy, both referenced in public reporting, can also be cross-referenced against registration databases. That means the boats in that photograph are potentially identifiable, and through those identifications, the people aboard them are potentially reachable. Brian Trasher confirmed that the United Cajun Navy had been asked to compare notes with the sheriff's office and that the two entities were cooperating. He also noted that a substantial number of people had already voluntarily contacted law enforcement after seeing their boats appear in publicly circulated photos, people who recognized their own vessels and came forward to give accounts of where they were and what they observed. That is meaningful. That is the public functioning as it should, in a case where official information has been tightly controlled. The critical window in this case is the period between approximately 4:30 p.m. and 7:30 p.m. on July 4th. By 4:31 p.m., according to GPS data, the Triton had departed. By 7:30 p.m., a witness report states that there was no one, no people, no activity, visible in the area where Nolan had last been seen. 3 hours. Somewhere in that 3-hour span, something happened to Nolan Wells. The question of where his body was during that time adds another layer of complexity. Forensic expert Dr. Joe Scott Morgan addressed this directly in public discussion of the case. Not all bodies float. Whether a body rises to the surface or sinks to the bottom depends on a range of variables: water temperature, the physical condition of the body, and critically, whether anything is physically blocking the body's movement toward the surface. Dr. Morgan pointed out that in cases involving large numbers of boats in a confined area, bodies have been found trapped beneath vessels. The people on those boats, unaware, continued with their activities while a body lay beneath them. Given the number of boats visible in the flotilla photograph, and given that they were anchored in relatively close proximity to where Nolan was last known to be, this possibility cannot be dismissed. It also cannot be confirmed without the information contained in the sealed autopsy. The autopsy has been completed. It has not been released. This is one of the defining frustrations of the public discourse around this case. The examination that could potentially answer the most fundamental questions, cause of death, manner of death, whether there is evidence of trauma to the body, what the toxicology report reveals, has been completed by the medical examiner. Its findings are known to investigators. They have not been shared with the public, with Nolan's family in any disclosed detail, or with the media. That is legally permissible during an active investigation. Law enforcement is under no obligation to publicly disclose autopsy findings while a case remains open. But the silence has allowed speculation to fill the space that facts would otherwise occupy. And in a case that has already attracted an enormous amount of public attention and a disturbing volume of misinformation, that silence has consequences. Nancy Grace, covering this case extensively on Crime Stories, has called for a second independent autopsy to verify the findings of the first. The purpose of an independent examination would be to confirm cause of death and to check specifically for any evidence of trauma, injuries consistent with an assault, a fall, or contact with a boat propeller that might not be apparent if the original examination were conducted under assumptions that favored a particular conclusion. That second autopsy, as of the information available in this reporting period, has not been publicly confirmed as having taken place. There is also a reported audio recording that has circulated in connection with this case. The content of that recording has been described in alarming terms by some who have discussed it publicly, with suggestions that it may contain statements relevant to what happened to Nolan. The authenticity of that recording has not been independently verified. It has not been confirmed as genuine by law enforcement. It has not been authenticated by forensic audio analysis on the public record. For those reasons, the substance of that recording cannot responsibly be reported as fact. What can be noted is that its existence has been raised in serious coverage of the case and that its potential significance, if verified, would be substantial. Authentication is the necessary next step before any conclusion can be drawn. What is also publicly documented is that a grand jury has reportedly been convened in connection with this case. A grand jury is a closed proceeding, one in which prosecutors present evidence to a panel of citizens to determine whether sufficient grounds exist to support an indictment. Grand juries do not determine guilt. They determine whether there is probable cause to believe a crime was committed and whether a specific person should be charged. The convening of a grand jury does not mean charges are imminent, but it does indicate that the investigation has reached a stage where prosecutors are actively evaluating the evidence. The existence of those proceedings, combined with the law enforcement silence on the public record, has led many observers to conclude, or at least to hope, that investigators are working the case more actively than the absence of public statements might suggest. The parallel that has been drawn repeatedly is to the Brian Kohberger case in Moscow, Idaho. In that investigation, the police department faced intense public criticism for appearing to make no visible progress in the weeks after 4 University of Idaho students were killed. The criticism was withering, and then investigators arrested Kohberger, and it became clear that throughout the period of apparent silence, they had been building a meticulous, highly detailed case. The restraint was strategic. That precedent gives some reason for cautious optimism in the Nolan Wells case. But cautious is the operative word. The United Cajun Navy's involvement in this case represents one of the more significant examples of organized civilian assistance in a missing persons and suspected wrongful death investigation in recent memory. The organization, which began as a volunteer water rescue network in Louisiana following major flooding events, has evolved into a recognized search and rescue force that has deployed across multiple states during disasters and missing person emergencies. In this case, their aerial search team was the one that spotted Nolan Wells' body. Their drone footage documented the search area, and their timeline report, compiled from public submissions, represents the most comprehensive publicly available reconstruction of the events of July 4th. Brian Trasher described the methodology. They received photos and videos from members of the public who had been at Horn Island or who had received materials from people who were. They cross-referenced those images against satellite imagery and Google Earth data to determine geographic positioning. They used the initial coordinates put out by the Coast Guard or Marine Patrol when the missing person report was filed to establish a baseline location. They used software to create an index sequence of the images, and where information could not be verified, they said so explicitly. That transparency is not a weakness. It is the correct way to handle unverified information. Present it, flag it, and let trained investigators determine its value. One individual, an internet researcher whom Trasher declined to name publicly without first obtaining her permission, was credited with significant contributions to the timeline's construction. This is consistent with the pattern observed in other high-profile cases where amateur analysts with specific technical skills have provided meaningful assistance to formal investigations, the Gabby Petito case being the most cited example, where dispersed campers identified Petito's Ford Transit van in a remote area that search teams had not prioritized, ultimately leading investigators to her remains. The witness question is perhaps the most consequential unresolved issue in this case, beyond the autopsy itself. The flotilla photograph on page 12 of the United Cajun Navy report shows not 1 or 2 bystanders, but what appears to be dozens of people distributed across multiple vessels, all in close proximity to the area where Nolan Wells was last known to be alive. If even a fraction of those individuals observed something, an argument, a fall, a person in distress, someone entering the water and not emerging, the cumulative picture of what happened on July 4th becomes much clearer. Dozens of people have reportedly spoken to law enforcement voluntarily, but the completeness of that witness canvas, whether every person identifiable in those photographs has been located, interviewed, and asked specific questions about what they observed, is not something the public can currently confirm. It has been publicly suggested that a dedicated tip line would help consolidate incoming information and make it easier for people who may not have realized the significance of what they witnessed to come forward. That suggestion has not resulted in a publicly announced mechanism as of the available reporting. The social media dimension of this case has been both valuable and destructive in equal measure. Valuable because it has produced a crowdsourced archive of photographic and video evidence from Horn Island on July 4th, evidence that would otherwise have remained fragmented across private phones and accounts. Destructive because it has also produced an enormous volume of unverified theories, misidentifications, and targeted harassment. Multiple people connected to the case, including Bart Edmondson, who did nothing more than tow a stranded boat, have reported receiving threats. Members of the United Cajun Navy have received threats. Even members of Nolan's extended social circle have faced online pressure and hostility that goes well beyond any reasonable public interest in the case. This matters because threats and harassment do not serve justice, they do the opposite. When potential witnesses feel that speaking publicly about what they know will expose them to abuse, they are less likely to speak. When people who might have useful information fear being mischaracterized or targeted, they stay silent. The social media environment surrounding this case has, in some respects, actively worked against the goal of finding out what happened to Nolan Wells. The call has been made, by Nancy Grace among others, for people with genuine information, photographs, videos, first-hand observations from July 4th at Horn Island, to contact law enforcement directly at 228-769-30